Okay. My name is Dave Royston, and I'm doing this webinar on behalf of my co-authors, who are also all members of the Drug Safety Monitoring Committee for the Nordic Aprotinin Patient Registry, or NAPAR. So the first question we've got to address is, why did we do this? And the answer comes in three parts, really. Firstly, as most people know, the drug was voluntarily withdrawn from the market by the market authorization holder at the time in 2007, who was Bayer Shearing. And the data for the reason for that was because of a study done in Canada, which is called the BART study. And the data from that and other studies was looked at by the regulators, and they decided that they would allow the drug to be relicensed. But as part of the so-called risk management strategy, the people in charge of this, who are the Pharmacological Risk Assessment Committee, or PRAC, said that they wanted to have a registry to produce something called a post-authorization safety study. And the regulators in Europe have decided that what they want to do now for safety data is to use large registries, and rather than using randomized double-blind studies. So that's why the registry was set up. The indication which was allowed was for isolated coronary artery bypass graft surgery, but the PRAC knew that the drug would be used for all sorts of reasons, and so therefore that's why the registry included non-authorized usage for data collection as well. So that was the basis of the study. You ask yourself, why is it then that we didn't aim to do a randomized controlled study? And that is because A, the PRAC basically do not require this now for safety data, they require it for efficacy data. And the other problem is that there are no safety data from a comparator drug, such as tranexamic acid, for things such as endocarditis, reoperation through a prior stenotomy, or aortic aneurysm surgery. So it would have been impossible to do a power analysis for the study. So that's the rationale for why we actually did this study. So the second question we needed to address from the data is, was there any evidence for an increase in mortality or for renal dysfunction? And because the mortality was suggested by the BART study, and renal dysfunction was shown in the earlier studies in the 1990s, which were originally performed by Bayer. It turns out now, if we look at the data, that because we haven't got a direct comparator group, we compared it with literature or current literature. If you look at the isolated coronary artery bypass graft data, 95% of it comes from Germany, the UK and France. So we compared it with those databases, and we could not show any increased prevalence of mortality in that group. Looking at the renal function data, we found exactly the same, that we couldn't show either an increase in a rise in plasma creatinine or need for new renal replacement therapy. For the non-isolated coronary artery bypass graft patients, we decided to use the data for acute aortic dissection because that had the highest incidence of mortality, stroke, and new renal dysfunction. And therefore, we anticipated if there was an effective aprotinin, it would be additive in that group. And again, when we compare the data for Europe, and also we included the North American data, we couldn't show any evidence for an increase in renal dysfunction shown by a rise in plasma creatinine of more than 44 micromole or need for new renal replacement therapy. There is one caveat to this, and that is that about 30% of people who had new renal replacement therapy did not have preoperative renal dysfunction or a rise in creatinine. So therefore, we think that now renal replacement therapy is being used not for renal disease, but for other things such as hyperkalemia or acidosis. And therefore, a rise in plasma creatinine may not be an ideal monitor for acute renal injury after major surgery. And the The final question I want to address is what was the effective age on these data? Because virtually all studies have exclusion criteria built into them, and what we wanted was real-world data. So we compared data from patients over the age of 75, which constituted about 20% of the population, and less than 75. And the interesting fact from that group was that in the over 75s, they actually had less evidence of morbidity and mortality. So they had less renal dysfunction, less stroke, etc., etc. But they also had much reduced cardiopulmonary bypass times. So we think that what clinicians are doing is they're not doing heroic surgery on the over 75-year-old age groups and subjecting them to major surgery, which they probably will not survive.